Hamilton is 1 minute faster in an Imola practice session. Stay until the end to find out why Leclerc didn't shake hands after the race. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. The motorsport world is on the brink of detonation, gripped by a saga that promises to become the most explosive rivalry of the modern era. What started as whispers behind the closed gates of Imola has erupted into a full-scale storm, a storm of speed, pride, and the battle for supremacy within the most iconic team in Formula One, Ferrari. But this is not just a story of cars and lap times. It's a collision of legacies, egos, and ambitions, all igniting under the blood-red banner of Maranello. At the epicenter stand two men, Lewis Hamilton, the 7-time world champion, and Charles Leclerc, Ferrari's chosen future, now locked in a battle that threatens to tear the Scuderia apart from the inside. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. The secrecy surrounding the private test at Imola was unprecedented, even by Ferrari's notoriously guarded standards. Security was absolute, no media, no drones, and team members stripped of devices capable of recording even a whisper of what unfolded. But tension, unlike information, cannot be contained. It seeped through the cracks of the garage walls, carried by every glance, every hurried radio call, every strained voice over the team comms. The air felt thick, so thick it could be cut with a knife, as if everyone present knew they were witnessing the opening shots of a war. And then, the roar of Hamilton's SF-25 shattered the silence. From the very first push lap, it was clear, Hamilton wasn't there to test. He was there to conquer. His lines were immaculate, his throttle control razor-sharp, his braking points millimetric. Engineers watched telemetry screens with bated breath, seeing the signature of greatness carved into every sector. But it was his third run, on a fresh set of softs, that broke the dam of disbelief. A purple sector 1. Purple sector 2. And then across the line, a time that wasn't just fast, it was staggering. Nearly a full second quicker than Leclerc's best effort. A gap so cavernous that it felt like a slap across the face of Maranello's golden boy. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. The garage fell into a stunned silence. Engineers, who had spent years building around Leclerc's feedback, now exchanged uneasy glances. Mechanics, loyal to their driver, gripped their tools a little tighter. And in the corner, Frederic Vasseur stood motionless, his face unreadable but his mind already racing through 1,000 scenarios. Because he knew, this was no ordinary intra-team battle. This was something far more dangerous. This was a civil war, and it was only just beginning. But what happened next would set the paddock ablaze. As Hamilton returned to the garage, helmet still on, visor down, he stepped from the car with the air of a man who had delivered a statement. And waiting for him, still in his race suit, still burning from the humiliation of the timing screens, was Leclerc. His helmet off, his expression raw, anger, disbelief, and something even more dangerous, defiance. He stepped forward, hand extended, not in friendship, but in confrontation. A silent challenge. Is this how it's going to be? Hamilton paused, his gloved hand halfway raised, and then, he lowered it. No handshake. No words. Just a slight, cold tilt of his head. The message was clear, yes. And you'd better be ready. The tension was volcanic. Crew members froze, eyes darting between the two titans, knowing they were witnessing the ignition of something that could burn through the entire season. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Hamilton turned and walked away, leaving behind only the smoldering aftermath of a gauntlet thrown. But the true battle was only just beginning. In the days that followed, Ferrari's internal walls trembled with division. Engineers, long accustomed to catering to Leclerc's style, found themselves mesmerized by Hamilton's feedback. Clinical, ruthless, and impossibly precise. He demanded changes to the suspension geometry, tweaks to the ERS deployment, even a complete overhaul of the steering feedback. And with every change, the stopwatch sang his praises. Yet, Leclerc refused to be eclipsed. He pushed harder, his times narrowing the gap, his driving raw with emotion, determination bleeding from every corner. But in the debrief room, the frost was undeniable. The two drivers barely exchanged words, their comments laced with veiled barbs, Hamilton's cool, analytical, Leclerc's sharp, defensive. Within the corridors of Maranello, whispers of division grew louder. Some engineers, captivated by Hamilton's legendary precision, began to align with his vision. Others, loyal to Leclerc, the prince they had raised from prodigy to contender, warned that the heart of Ferrari belonged with the future, not the past. And at the center of it all stood Vasseur, his face lined with the pressure of holding together a team fracturing under the weight of its own ambition. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. But perhaps the most telling moment came not on the track, but within the factory walls. An anonymous insider described a confrontation during a closed-door meeting, a clash not of fists, but of philosophies. When the topic of car development arose, Hamilton, his voice measured but firm, argued for a direction that favored his late-breaking, aggressive style. Leclerc, his voice tight but burning with pride, pushed back, advocating for the balance and rotation he had spent years perfecting. The room, filled with the brightest minds in motorsport, watched in tense silence as the two giants fought not for seconds, but for the soul of the car itself. Yet, for all the turmoil, the paddock knows one thing: war, however destructive, forges legends. And legends, when they collide, create moments that define eras. As the days count down to the first Grand Prix, the question is no longer whether Hamilton and Leclerc will clash. It is when, and how fiercely. Because when the lights go out, it won't just be two Ferraris racing. It will be two legacies, two destinies, and the certainty that in the end, only one can emerge as the true king of Maranello. And for the fans, for the world watching breathlessly, there is but one promise. This will not be a season. It will be a war. Leclerc was the first to charge onto the circuit, and from the very moment his tires scorched the tarmac, it was evident. This wasn't just a lap, it was a declaration. The SF-24B, a snarling beast of raw power and razor-thin margins, responded to his commands with a mix of fury and grace. But Charles wasn't here to tame it. He was here to break it in, to bend it, force it, and push it beyond its limits. The engine's howl reverberated through the trees, a primal scream of combustion and chaos as he flung the car into Tamburello. His approach? Brutal. The brakes glowed as he stomped down with millimeter-perfect timing, the car twitching and writhing under the force. His hands, a blur on the wheel, fought the snap of the rear, his body locked in a silent war with inertia. Yet, he emerged victorious, threading the needle through the chicane with breathtaking precision. The telemetry, an orchestra of numbers and data, lit up in the garage, purple in Sector 1. Gasps rippled through the engineers. His pace was ferocious, but it was more than speed, it was intent. Ac Minerali, a place where bravery and madness collide, approached fast. Most drivers brake with a heartbeat of hesitation. Not Charles. He lunged into the corner with the confidence of a man chasing the edge of control. The rear skittered, on the verge of breaking free, but he caught it, balancing on the razor-thin line between genius and disaster. A whisper of gravel kicked up behind him, a reminder of how close he danced to ruin. His engineer's voice pierced through the chaos, urgent, pleading, "Manage the tires, Charles." But his response was in his driving. He wrung the car's neck even harder. Through Variante Alta, he soared over the curbs, the car jolting, sparks cascading from beneath the floor. His foot remained buried on the throttle, daring physics to keep up. By the time he powered out of Ravazza, the SF-24B was screaming for mercy, but Charles was deaf to it. The line flashed. The time froze. 1 minute and 15.783 seconds. A stunned silence blanketed the garage. Eyes widened. Hands hovered over keyboards, motionless. It was a lap not just of pace but of fury, pure undiluted aggression. Yet, inside the cockpit, Leclerc's eyes remained cold, calculating. The time meant nothing. Because his true measure wasn't the clock. It was the next car. It was Hamilton. The paddock seemed to shift as Lewis Hamilton emerged from the shadows of the Mercedes garage. The 7-time world champion, an architect of chaos on the track, moved with a predator's poise. There was no rush, no urgency in his stride. But there was something far more dangerous: certainty. His helmet slipped on like a crown forged from war, and when the engine ignited beneath him, it felt as though the earth itself trembled. His hands, seasoned by 1,000 battles, rested lightly on the wheel. And in his silence there was a promise that everything was about to change. Out on track, his opening laps were surgical, every apex kissed, every line pristine. But the paddock whispered, too neat, too composed. The engineers watched the telemetry with furrowed brows. His times were quick, but not record-shattering. The tension simmered. Was he playing the long game? Was he reading the car's soul, feeling its pulse, before unleashing the storm? And then the radio cracked, his voice sliding through with a lethal calm. "All right. Let's send it." And send it he did. Suddenly, the Mercedes transformed, from composed to feral. Into Tamburello, he attacked the curbs with reckless precision, the suspension howling as the car danced on the brink. At Villeneuve, he stayed impossibly wide, kissing the edge of the grass before snapping back to the racing line with the ruthlessness of a blade through silk. The rear of the car twitched violently, but his hands, those legendary hands, caught it in a heartbeat, the correction so fluid it felt like part of the choreography. Then came Ac Minerali, a place where courage dies. But Lewis didn't lift. The car snapped sideways, a violent, heart-stopping slide. Time seemed to freeze. But he caught it, not with panic, but with instinct. He opened the steering fractionally, let the car breathe, then slammed back on the power before anyone could even exhale. Purple, Sector 2. The garage erupted into motion. Engineers, mechanics, strategists, watching with disbelief as the telemetry pulsed with raw brilliance. He was dancing on a knife's edge, and the blade was his. Variante Alta, he didn't take the curb. He launched over it. The car left the ground, and for a fraction of a second, the Mercedes and the laws of physics parted ways. But gravity couldn't hold him. The car landed with a bone-shaking thud, no lift. Full throttle. Through Rivazza, he was millimeter perfect, the power delivery so savage it seemed as though the car itself was clawing at the track, desperate to escape his wrath. The line. The stopwatch. 1 minute and 15.752 seconds. 300ths quicker. 300ths. The length of a blink, a heartbeat. The gap was microscopic, but the impact was seismic. The Mercedes garage ignited, shouts, fists pounding tables, hands in hair. Yet, amidst the chaos, Hamilton sat still. Unshaken. Unbothered. He didn't need to see the time. He felt it. But his eyes, cold and sharp, flicked to the monitor. Because this wasn't over. He knew who was watching. In the Ferrari garage, Charles Leclerc's visor reflected one thing, 1 minute and 15.752 seconds. His jaw tensed, his fingers flexing on the wheel as if ready to take it back. The sting of defeat? No. It was fuel. And in that fuel, a wildfire of determination erupted. He keyed the radio, his voice low but charged. Copy. Let's do it again. The tension was unbearable. Engineers stared at screens, heart rate spiking as their warriors prepared for the second strike. In every corner of the paddock, every whisper spoke of the same thing. Two titans, two forces of nature, locked in combat with the stopwatch as their battlefield. But for Hamilton and Leclerc, it wasn't about the time. It was about who breaks first. And the truth? Neither of them would. Because this wasn't just qualifying. It was war. And the final shot hadn't been fired. Not even close. The next lap was not just a display of speed, it was a declaration of supremacy. It felt less like a car against the track, and more like a force of nature bending reality to its will. Hamilton wasn't driving, he was commanding, turning Imola into his personal arena and defying every limit that engineering, physics, and courage could impose. As he screamed into Tamburello, he didn't merely take the racing line, he owned it. The front tires clung to the tarmac as if welded to it, while the rear floated on the razor's edge of adhesion, a heartbeat from chaos. His throttle stayed pinned, no feathering, no second-guessing, just raw, unrelenting aggression. Data would later show that his minimum corner speed through Tamburello was higher than most cars hit on the exit. Every brush of the curb was precise, like a scalpel slicing through the track, leaving perfection in its wake. Then came Villeneuve, a complex that punishes hesitation and rewards mastery. Hamilton entered with terrifying speed, the front end biting as the rear snapped into an oversteer twitch that would have spelled disaster for anyone else. But his correction was instinctive, so fast it was almost invisible. His wrists flicked, his feet stayed flat, and the car obeyed, skimming through the apex with a velocity that felt illegal. The onboard camera showed his hands, calm, composed, surgical, as the chassis screamed through the violence of the corner. Trackside microphones caught the savage sound of tires protesting, rubber shrieking against asphalt, but Hamilton's car refused to let go. But it was Piratella where he truly defied logic. A blind, high-speed plunge that tests a driver's soul, where even milliseconds of doubt translate to disaster. Yet Hamilton arrived as if gravity had no authority over him. His turn-in was impossibly early, grazing the inside curb so closely that it sent a burst of dust into the air. The car wobbled, teetering on the brink of a spin, but he countered with the slightest hint of opposite lock. The exit margin was microscopic, the outside wheels whispering against the track limits. In the garage, a Ferrari engineer muttered, "He can't have kept that legal, but the replay would show otherwise." It was perfect. Legal by the thickness of a coat of paint. Then came the beast, Ac Minerali, where legends are tested and courage often dies. It's a place that forces even the greatest drivers to lift, to flinch, to fear. But Hamilton? He stayed flat. His engine note never dipped, a scream of defiance against physics. The bump sent the car into a violent snap of oversteer, twice, maybe 3 times in rapid succession. But his hands were quicker, steering corrections so subtle they looked like an extension of thought rather than reaction. The undertray struck the ground, sending a plume of sparks erupting behind him, a comet trail of rebellion against the laws of grip. Engineers watching live telemetry saw the car's slip angle spike into insanity, yet he gained time. How? No one could answer. Not even the computer simulations predicted this. Variante Alta was next, the chicane that destroys dreams and bends suspensions. Hamilton didn't just take the curbs, he annihilated them. His car launched violently into the air, 4 wheels off the ground, the undercarriage slamming down with a shriek of tortured carbon fiber and a burst of sparks on landing. The onboard camera shook so violently it blurred, yet Hamilton's hands remained as still as if he were sipping tea on a Sunday afternoon. He powered out of the chicane with such ferocity that even his rival's engineers paused, their eyes frozen on the delta, because they knew. That sector split? 3/10 quicker than anyone all weekend. In one corner. But it wasn't over. The final sector at Imola demands everything, precision, power and poetry, and Hamilton delivered all 3. Through Ravazza 1, he trail-braked deeper than anyone dared, the car squirming as if screaming under the violence. But he kept it balanced, on the edge of adhesion, right on the knife. Ravazza 2 was a masterpiece of exit speed. He planted the throttle early, the rear sliding just enough to rotate the car perfectly onto the straight. His DRS opened with a hiss, and he surged forward, the Mercedes power unit howling in triumph. The timing screen stuttered for a second, almost as if the system itself was stunned. Then, the number appeared. 1 minute and 14.812 seconds. The garage exploded into chaos. Engineers yelled over each other, some cheering, some demanding instant replays, some scrambling to check telemetry for errors. Track limits, someone barked. The replays rolled instantly. Frame by frame. No wheels off. Not even close. No toe. No tricks. Just brilliance. And then, slicing through the storm of disbelief, came the voice. Calm. Sharp. Inevitable. How's that for a first date? Hamilton's voice, drenched in a smirk you could hear. The garage erupted again, laughter, shock, euphoria. But not everyone was laughing. In the Ferrari garage, the mood was funereal. Charles Leclerc stood as if turned to stone, his eyes welded to the monitor, replaying the lap over and over. His engineer's voice was a distant murmur, a haze of words, fuel loads, engine modes. Maybe a tailwind in Sector 2, excuses. They felt hollow. Meaningless. Charles's gloves creaked, his fists clenched so tightly that the leather strained under the pressure. His jaw locked, his teeth grinding behind sealed lips. A mechanic near the back of the garage later described the air as frigid, as if the room itself had lost warmth. The Red Sea of Ferrari, so often a united front, felt fractured. It wasn't just a lap. It was a line, drawn deep and dark, separating what was possible from what wasn't. The room was silent, but the message was deafening. Hamilton had just redefined the limit. And in that cold silence, Charles's heart burned hotter than ever. His eyes, lit with a fury only defeat could forge, whispered a promise that no one heard but everyone felt. This wasn't finished. It was just the beginning. And then it happened. The deafening roar of the engines had died, but what replaced it was even louder, the pounding silence of unresolved battle, a tension so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The heat of the race clung to everything. The smell of scorched rubber, the haze of fuel, the static in the atmosphere. But none of that compared to the electricity crackling between two men, two titans whose fight wasn't over just because the checkered flag had fallen. Hamilton moved first. The veteran. The legend. His helmet, now under his arm, revealed a face carved from experience. Sweat glistening across his brow, his jaw set, his expression a masterclass in controlled intensity. His walk was purposeful, each step heavy with history and the echoes of 1,000 battles fought and won. His eyes, those eyes, burned with something ancient, something primal. But beneath that fire, there was calculation. And then there was Leclerc. Young. Brilliant. Hungry. His chest still heaved from the brutal physicality of the race, his suit clinging to him like armor after war. But his eyes? Cold. Focused. He stood still, but every line of his body screamed defiance, like a lion daring the king to step into his territory. Hamilton reached him, and in a move that felt both unexpected and inevitable, he extended his hand. Not quickly. Slowly. Deliberately. A gesture that was more than sportsmanship. It was a test. An offering and a challenge wrapped into one. His voice, smooth but tight with exertion and something harder, something personal, cut through the charged air. "Great drive out there, Charles," he said. The words were praise, but the undertone was unmistakable, a sharp edge, a subtle dare. "You made me dig deep for that one." For a heartbeat, the world froze. The bustle of the garage, the frantic chatter of engineers, the clicking of cameras, the distant hum of machinery, fell away into nothingness. All eyes snapped to Leclerc, waiting. The air felt sharp, like the moment before lightning strikes. But Leclerc didn't move. His gaze locked with Hamilton's, and when he spoke, his voice was a blade, cold, clear, and cutting. "I don't need your compliments, Lewis," he said, each syllable delivered with the precision of a well-aimed strike. "This is my team." The impact of those words hit harder than any crash at 300 kilometers per hour. A claim. A declaration. Not of victory, but of dominance. Territory. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, oppressive, and alive with unsaid things. The mechanics, seasoned veterans of tension, froze mid-task, tools hanging uselessly in their hands. The engineers, their earpieces buzzing with data, went still, their focus consumed by something more important than numbers. Journalists, cameras already rolling, sensed they were capturing not just a post-race moment, but a chapter of history being written in real time. Hamilton's hand, still outstretched, seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. A bridge refused. And then with a slow, almost theatrical grace, he let it fall. His fingers curled loosely at his side, but his posture, his aura, remained towering, unshaken. His face, schooled by years of triumph and heartbreak, revealed nothing. But his eyes, they spoke. They burned with a new intensity, cold and sharp. A predator's gaze, amused and dangerous. "Your team," he repeated, his voice lower now, the warmth drained away, replaced with something colder, something laced with promise. "We'll see about that." The words landed like a spark on dry tinder. The rivalry, already simmering beneath the surface, ignited into something raw and personal. This wasn't about points or podiums. It was about pride. About legacy. About throne and crown. Suddenly, another voice sliced through the tension, hoarse, urgent, and edged with command. Frederick Vasseur, a man who had seen wars fought on track and in boardrooms, barked into the tempest of egos. "Enough," he snapped, his voice tight with authority and the weariness of a man holding the line between chaos and collapse. "We're not racing each other. Not today." But the words fell like raindrops on a wildfire. Too little, too late. The battle lines were already drawn, and neither soldier was willing to retreat. Hamilton's lips pressed together briefly, then parted again, his voice, now soft, somehow more lethal for its quietness. "You're quick, kid," he said, and the way he said it made the word quick feel like both a compliment and an insult, acknowledgement wrapped in dismissal. But being quick isn't enough. Leclerc's reply came like a gunshot, sharp, immediate, and merciless. "Quick is everything," he said, his voice steady and cold as marble, "when you're in front." Hamilton's mouth twitched, something between a smirk and a warning. It wasn't a smile. It was the shape a predator's mouth makes before it strikes. The air between them felt alive, thick with something primal, like the moments before a storm tears the sky apart. "You'd better get comfortable back there," Hamilton said, his voice now a promise, low and lethal. "Because you'll be chasing me soon enough." But Leclerc's eyes didn't flicker. They blazed with something even more dangerous than talent: conviction. "I don't chase," he said, his voice like ice. "I hunt." The air snapped. An invisible explosion of tension rippled through the garage, and the unspoken truth was felt by everyone witnessing the scene: this wasn't over. This wasn't settled. The track had only been the beginning. Because some battles are won with overtakes. Others, with strategy. But the greatest? The greatest are fought in moments like these, where words are weapons, and pride is the prize. As they turned, going their separate ways, Hamilton toward his team, Leclerc toward his car, one truth remained undeniable. The fight had just begun. And it was going to be war. The silence that followed the confrontation was deafening, a charged, razor-sharp stillness that felt more dangerous than any shouted word. The air itself seemed to crackle, thick with the heat of unspoken challenges. Leclerc's face was a battlefield of emotions: anger, pride, defiance, all colliding beneath his skin. His lips pressed into a thin, unforgiving line, his jaw tight as steel. Without a word, he turned, swift, sharp, every movement a blade cutting through the tension. His steps hit the floor with a rhythm that felt like the pounding of war drums, each one echoing with his unyielding fury. His back was straight, his fists clenched, but the rigid set of his shoulders betrayed the tempest boiling within. This was not over. Not by a long shot. Hamilton didn't move. He stood rooted, his eyes locked on the space where Leclerc had vanished. His expression was something primal, calm, but with a predator's edge. The corners of his mouth, barely curved, spoke of amusement laced with certainty. His eyes, however, were cold and calculating, measuring not just the man who had walked away but the fight that had just been promised without a single syllable exchanged. And when he finally spoke, his voice, low, steady, and dripping with a quiet, deadly confidence, sliced through the charged air like a knife. "He'll be fast tomorrow. But I'll be faster." The paddock exploded. News didn't travel, it detonated. What had started as whispers behind closed doors became a full-blown eruption within hours. Ferrari's fortress, usually sealed tight, had sprung leaks, and the world outside devoured every drop. Reports surfaced online, their headlines blazing like flares in the night. Clash in the Cavallino, Leclerc and Hamilton's heated moment. Social media became an inferno: X, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, every platform flooded with theories, replays, and breakdowns. The video, shaky and grainy but unmistakably electric, was everywhere: Leclerc's cold exit, Hamilton's smirk, and that loaded final line. In studios and live streams, the analysts circled like sharks. Frame by frame, they dissected every micro-expression, every glance, every muscle twitch. Was Leclerc cracking under pressure? Or was this the spark that would ignite his brilliance? Was Hamilton playing mind games, or was this his battle cry? On podcasts, commentators revived echoes of rivalries past. "This feels like Sennaprost all over again," some declared. Others invoked Schumacher, Alonso, Vettel. But the truth was clear: this wasn't nostalgia. This was something new. Something raw. Something alive. But beneath the headlines and beyond the cameras, deep in the heart of the garages, the tension was molten. The Ferrari compound, usually a temple of precision and control, felt like a pressure cooker about to burst. Conversations were clipped and sharp-edged, heavy with subtext. Engineers pored over telemetry with a fervor bordering on obsession. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. This wasn't just about lap times, it was about pride. The mechanics, hardened veterans of countless battles, exchanged knowing glances as they worked. They had seen this before. This was war. And it had already begun, long before a wheel touched the track. The simulator room, usually silent and dark after hours, was alive, its cold bluish glow slicing through the night. Inside, Leclerc was a man possessed. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles blanched. His eyes, hard and unblinking, burned into the digital track as he pushed himself beyond the limit. Imola, the same curves, the same straights, but this wasn't practice. It was something far more personal. He wasn't racing against a computer, he was racing against Hamilton. Lap after lap, he fought through every apex, chasing perfection measured in milliseconds. The engineers monitoring his runs saw the numbers, saw the fury in his driving. Aggressive. Relentless. but just shy of what he wanted. They could hear it, too, in the clipped, terse radio responses. He wasn't chasing victory, he was hunting vengeance. And he wasn't going to stop until he had it. But while Leclerc battled ghosts in the digital world, Hamilton rested in the real one. Miles away, he slept deeply, his breath slow and steady. Not from arrogance, but from certainty. He knew what was coming. He welcomed it. He lived for it. Because the battle wasn't won in the simulator or the headlines. It was won in the crucible of the race itself, where instinct, courage, and precision collided at 300 kilometers per hour. And when a close source reached him for comment the next morning, hungry for his thoughts on the escalating drama, Hamilton's response came with the cool, effortless sharpness of a man who knows his own legend. Tension? No. Just competition. But if he wants a fight, he'll get one. By sunrise, the entire motorsport world was holding its breath. But Imola, the ancient gladiators' arena, stood waiting. Its curves, sharp and unforgiving, had already buried dreams and crowned kings. It was more than asphalt, it was sacred ground, and today it would witness something primal, an unfiltered collision of wills. This was no mere rivalry of cars and teams. It was a war of identities. Hamilton, the living legend, a master sculpted by time, speed, and steel. A man who wore pressure like armor, who turned mind games into an art form. And Leclerc, the rising storm young but scarred, forged in heartbreak and ambition, with fire burning in every heartbeat. If Hamilton was the king, Leclerc was the usurper, and he wasn't knocking on the throne. He was coming to rip it from its foundation. The duel wasn't about points or trophies. It was about something far older, far more primal, dominance. It would be fought in every braking zone and every millimeter of asphalt. Overtakes wouldn't be maneuvers, they would be declarations. Defenses wouldn't be tactics, they would be ultimatums. This wasn't about who was faster. It was about who was willing to bleed more for the right to be called the best. And the track, the eternal judge, would decide. Engines would scream. Tires would burn. The world would watch. And when the dust settled, there would be no peace, only the promise of the next battle. Because in Formula One, rivalries never end. They only evolve. And the war between Hamilton and Leclerc had just taken its first breath. But it would never take its last.